it's really great that Stefano has organised this conference, and I think it's a really, really great topic to focus in on research methods, and I think it's just what IDOCS needs right now. So that's really brilliant. So well done. And yeah, just a quick provocation to start. But for us, so yeah, we convene biannual symposia in Bristol, and we call ourselves IDOCS. But we're very clear that that is what we've done is we've created a space for an interdisciplinary or a transdisciplinary conversation across different cultures, we hope, across universities and industry and also into communities. And in response to Ursak's provocation about new media, for me, new media creates a binary with old media, and whenever you get into those binaries, I work in a film department, and when I talk about new media, they get very defensive about new media and film. So they're saying, are you saying then that film's dead and that the new media is this? And what's new about the internet? The internet's been around now for 20 odd years, and it just, I find it creates conflict with some of my colleagues, and they get very defensive. And I always think Douglas Adams, who was a pioneering visionary in England, he was a storyteller, and he wrote a lot about technology in the future, but in a storytelling way. And he said once that it was necessary to have the word interactivity just in response to the predominant media of the 20th century, which, cinema, film, television, and newspapers, where print culture and film culture had created these closed set narratives. Although with newspapers they're evolving, but you have an editorial, you have an author, they'll write a point of view, and then you can write a letter or you can write your own, but it's all about authorship and fixed positions. And he said that that actually, in terms of the history of humanity, that's actually a blip, and we've had oral storytelling for many, many years before that. So he said it was necessary to use the word interactive just to kind of re-inject those debates about other ways of communicating ideas, more open-ended ways of storytelling at the time. And Alexandre Brachet, who's one of the big pioneers of interactive media in France, in Paris, he was over in Bristol last week, and Arnaud interviewed him, but he asked the question of many practitioners, what is interactive documentary? And Brachet said, I don't think we need that term anymore, I think it's just documentary now, and that we've had that moment where we've had to kind of position it in order to start a community and start a debate. But now that we've got that community, his view is it's just another way of telling stories alongside the others, and that we actually need all of these literacies, and they're useful for different contexts. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because I think if we drop making our fields a special identified thing, whatever we call it, I'm not really bothered about names, but if we drop that, I think we might get a bit lost, especially at the moment when we're getting quite a strong pushback against openness, against multiculturalism, against trying to understand other perspectives, against liberal values, basically. So what I'm talking about today is, in a way, is my response to Brexit, to Trump, to what's happening in the world at the moment. And we talk a lot, about why IDOCS matters and why the literacies of IDOCS are needed, not in opposition to, but alongside the other media and the other literacies that we have. So my ideal would be that this would become something that is taught in schools. I mean, it is being taught. Kids are being taught coding anyway, and our younger generation are all using Snapchat. But to try and teach literacies so that people are using it within their own learning and their own education, so that schools are embracing it, and it's not something that kids are doing when they get their phones confiscated at school. How we can control this and actually use it intelligently. So I wrote an article This is the book, which came out in February, and in it, so we talk about evolving practices, and in it I wrote a chapter on interactive documentary and live performance. That was my contribution. I've also co-edited all the others, but that was to make the point that it's not just the internet that interactive documentary is finding, and it's not just one-to-one, screen-based individual engagement, that IDOCS is also, interactive documentary is also finding other forms of expression, and I just looked at all the ways it's being used within a live, face-to-face, performative context, which is often a collective, shared experience. Just to put that into the mix as another way of thinking about and working with interactive documentary. And through that, I ended up at this term, emplaced interaction, that I'll talk a bit more about later. But basically, it's a paradigm that moves on from embodied interaction, which the human-computer interface designer Paul Dowrish came up with. And that was him coming from computing, saying we need to put the body, we need to put senses and feelings inside the way we think about computers. So we need to incorporate that alongside the cognitive aspects. So that was his paradigm. But then my background, I'm an anthropologist, and I've been talking a lot with Paolo, another anthropologist called Sarah Pink, and another one who's an anthropologist of the senses called David Howes, and they talk about emplacement, and that's about recognising not just your own body, your own mind and your own body, but also recognising the wider context of the environment around you, and the physicality of environment and the physicality of sense of place, and how we are framed by our engagement with place and the sense of place, and with materiality and the sensory materiality of the world. So they proposed being an emplaced ethnographer, where you're doing ethnographic research with that wider awareness of how sense of place affects you as an ethnographer and how sense of place affects the people that you're working with. So to have a conversation about that environment, the materiality of the world, alongside thinking about body and mind. So then I came up with this idea of emplaced interaction, and there I talk about it in relation to live performance. But since writing, or saying I was going to write about live performance, with all the Brexit and all the need for transcultural communication, I'm now doing another body job of work, which is mapping the transdisciplinary ways of working of IDOCS onto the transcultural ways that I think we could all usefully engage with in the world, and we could teach our students and try and get these literacies embedded into our education systems at a time when that's not the easiest thing to be trying to do. So that's my motivation. So for me, IDOCS, what got me interested in interactive documentary in the first place was multiple perspectives and multiple points of view. And I'd been working a lot with an anthropologist around this, using juxtaposition, non-linearity. And when this project came out in 2008, its intention and what it was trying to do resonated with me, and it still does. So it's Israel, Palestine, everyday life, talking about peace in times of war, the interface. It was done over 40 days. Every day 2 new short documentaries were put up about everyday life. And that interface creates a wall, but it's a wall that in a virtual world can be broken down, and you can see the 2 points of view. Its potential for starting a conversation, starting a dialogue, I think is massive and very exciting. And I think there's still more to do with that particular grammar. So the thing I've been really keen to do as a curator of IDOCS is to make it very clear that for us, interactive documentary isn't a genre, it's a field, a set of practices that are constantly evolving, it's constantly in flux. So it's about being open, it's about the openness, which is a theme that we keep coming back to. And I did, if anyone's interested, for Sage Knowledge, I made, you can find that on YouTube, I did a short piece about my take on interactive documentary. So that's quite useful if you want to get more of my perspective. And then Sandra and I, in 2012, we edited a special edition of Journal of Documentary Studies. We wrote a piece, interactive documentary, setting the field, where the word genre is in there. I wish I could kind of revisit that. So in 2012, the word genre crept in there once. I was tussling with Sandra at the time about it, but it is in there in one place. But we said any project that intends to document the real, inverted commas, hugely contested, what does that mean? And that does so by using digital interactive technology can be called an interactive documentary. In this, I talk about the human-computer interface. So for me, interactive documentary is how documentary is responding to computers and human-computer interfaces. And for me, that's what the computer and its interactive, non-linear possibilities brings to documentary making. And then we've gone on in our book. We had a great tussle about that definition, what our definition was now, what we meant by reality. I've worked a lot with Tibetan monks, so for me reality isn't just the physical, it's a mental construct as well. So we ended up coming up with this definition that it's a shifting concept which is about lived experience, in line with Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, idea that it's rocks and dreams are both part of our lived experience. So in other words, mental realities and physical realities all make up our experience of the lived world. And I kind of settle on that definition. So in 2016, our latest IDOCS, I convened, with a lot of help from Anna, Tools for Thought, which was one of the core themes for our symposium. So now I was really, trying to look at how interactive documentary can be, how we can look at it as a way of thinking, a way of addressing the world, a way of engaging with the world, and really thinking about evolving literacies. And one of our delegates, Ramona Pringle, such a great name, really great woman, and she responded to, it was the first afternoon where we really started looking at these tools for thought, and she just said, interactive documentary appeals to us because the world is complicated. There's not always one story, but many intersecting. And that, for me, summarises why interactive documentary, or whatever we want to call it, as a way of looking at the world, as a form of literacy, is really important, because the world is complicated, and the media that we have on its own, film, cinema, books, they all help us address that, but so can these new literacies, and we need all of them, in my view. So I reference a lot Ted Nelson, who was one of the early computer pioneers, who came up with concepts about hypermedia and hypertext, and he said everything is deeply intertwingled, and this is this transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary. We always want to categorise, we always want to put things in boxes, we always want to create simple narratives to try and understand the world, because the world is hugely complex and we can't possibly embrace everything. So it's like when children are born, they can't see, because if they could see, they'd be just totally freaked out by everything that they'd have to take on board. So, everything's intertwingled. This is the pox and the snooze. This is the interconnectedness of knowledge. It links back to Vannevar Bush in 1946. Had this idea of creating a Memex, a sort of desk where you could access all these different bits of information from different sources, and you could start to create new connections. These are all ideas that took us to the internet. So complexity has to be confronted. It's what's out there in the world, and if we just retreat into nationalism, into this is what I know, and if you come to my house or my country, you have to do this because this is the rules, it doesn't really work in our globalised world. So we can't afford not to take this on board. And this is one of the latest books of Donald Norman, who is fantastic. I think he's absolutely brilliant. So he talks about human-computer interface design. And this book, Living with Complexity, he said that you actually, just because the world's complex doesn't mean you have to get hugely confusing. You can deal with complexity and find simple ways to communicate things. So he uses the pepper pots you know, the signifiers, the signals, we know culturally what's salt and what's pepper through a very simple piece of design. But he makes the point that that's still cultural, that we know that, but if you've never come across a salt and pepper pot, you wouldn't know what that meant. So you still have to see that simplicity is often has a cultural layer on it that needs to be explained or negotiated. But he makes this really useful distinction between complexity and complicated. And he said things don't need to be complicated to reflect complexity. And for me, I think that's really useful. So when thinking about complexity, I've been thinking about the other side, simplicity, and I've been finding lots of quotes from people. And somebody said, simplicity is something that we all aspire to, but that we shouldn't trust it. You know, so we're always trying to find ways of representing things, but at the same time, when we find that way, we should recognise it's partial and that it's not universal, and it still needs to be negotiated. And I think that's really useful. So here we are, Pox and Snooze. So I got Florian to do a talk for iDocs, because he always says nobody understands him, and his software is it's complicated for most people. So I said, don't talk about your software, talk about the wider concepts behind your software. And he made the most brilliant presentation, which is online, called The Way We Tell Stories. So it was filmed, and he's edited it, and he said it was the best experience for him, and he worked for hours to communicate this through this talk at iDocs, and we talked a lot about it. And it really distills what he wants to say. It distills his conceptual model of the world. And what he said was he described himself as living on Korsakoff Island. So he lives there with his wife in this conceptual place that is, for him, is a very simple place. He's a very not simple, but he's a very minimalist. He doesn't need a lot. He doesn't have a lot of material things. So he lives happily and quite simply on Korsakoff Island, but every day he teleports onto Linear Island to go and work in a news agency. And so he sees both of these worlds, and he's a great storyteller. And he just talked about how in the news agency they're always looking to find the extremes, and he talked about the model of Hollywood storytelling, and he thinks it's infected our minds, and that we're so used to that conceptual model that we expect our stories, and that might be me, to take us always to deal with extremes, and then always to deal with conflict. The Hollywood stories love conflict, conflict loves extremes, stories love extremes, and he said we've got ourselves in this mindset where conflict is what we expect. And he said if you look at this bit in the middle, the normal, everyday life, there isn't conflict there. It might be boring in terms of storytelling if you're used to having these dramatic stories, but if you're not hooked on causality, which he said has become a sort of Western disease in, trying to explain things through causality. I'm going through something with my sister. I can say, well, she did that because she thinks that. It's actually often people's actions are very complicated and there's many factors. And so he said, all this stuff that gets ignored, all those many factors as to why people might think they're in conflict get ignored, so people continue to think they're in conflict. And that's a problem that we are in, which is why we need these literacies. So I wrote a piece, interactive documentary, what does it mean, why does it matter? And in response to the Tools for Thought and in response to iDocs 2016, which is really good. A lot of people are reading that, so I find that quite heartwarming that, there's a lot of people out there who agree that we need to do something. And then more recently I've gone back to my anthropological roots. So this is where I'm mapping complexity onto thick description. Clifford Geertz is an anthropologist, and he wrote about thick description in 1973, and it's the whole idea of explaining not just behaviour, but its context, so that the behaviour becomes meaningful to an outsider, analysing the multiple levels of meaning in any situation. So simply, text is thin description, context is thick description. Really simple. I think iDocs, interactive documentary, is really good at that. And our external examiner in Bristol, way back in the early days, who she's a very good friend of, what's her name? Her name's gone, but she's Mary somebody. She a big name in Ireland who's been involved with the United Nations and with peace talks. You know, a hugely influential woman in the world. And Mari wrote this book back in the 1990s called Contextual Media, saying that that's what at the time interactive multimedia, which is like the forerunner to interactive documentary, or you know that particular way of that strand, its real strength is that it's contextual media and that we can open things up and look at things from more complex angles. But again, she said you don't have to make the work really complicated in order to convey context. And then Sarah Pink found this article and posted it a while back in response to Trump. And this is an anthropologist, Paul Stoller, in America, who is blogging for the Huffington Post. And he's writing some quite out there blog posts. And he's just written a letter to Jared Kushner, to Ivanka Trump's husband, an open letter saying, suggesting that he should go back to his business affairs and that applying business models to politics in the long run it won't work. And he's written a fictive letter as if he was Jared Kushner's uncle, because he's got Kushners in his own family. So he said, imagine I'm your uncle, imagine I'm giving you some advice. And so he's written that, and this is his challenge to anthropologists and ethnographers, to say that, you know, ethnographers are trained in deep listening and in thick description and in context. That's what they do. And he said if there'd been ethnographers on the ground in those Trump heartlands, they perhaps would have been able to tell us all and tell Obama not to rely on the big data and not to rely on statistics, because they weren't telling the full story, and actually he needed to be in those heartlands campaigning. And had he been there, had he been talking to people and listening to them, this might not have happened. And actually the problem in America and also in Britain, people don't feel they've been listened to. So along comes some great leader who says, I'll listen to you. And that, it's all about being listened to, which is what anthropology can do really well and what maps really well onto interactive documentary. And I haven't got time to go into detail about in-placed interaction and interaction. And then I talk about in-placed interaction as, initially in the book I wrote about it as a philosophical underpinning, but now with this intervention I think it could also be a research method that puts audience and agency at the centre and that unites mind and body with wider environment. And that's the book where we kind of, there's lots of openings for a lot of many different angles. So this is only one angle for interactive documentary and research, looking at the world. It's the one I'm particularly interested in, but there's a million and one other research, not least is the ethics of VR. There's a massive research thing to be done there about empathy and whether VR really can take us into the mind of another person. And I think that's a really scary proposition that really needs unpicking. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Judith, for your presentation. Really, really inspiring. And thank you very much for all the work you have done and still you will keep doing for the field, interactive documentary. So complexity, which is one of the key words of today, I guess. And I really love the idea of how you do it, basically connecting complexity with your field, with anthropology. There's a lot of that, and it's really definitely something that should be explored further. And also, also how you can somehow summarize and this overview on the field of iDocs, since back in the 90s with the book with contextual media, which is a key text again in the field. So, is there any question from the audience? Any question? No? Okay, let's do something then. So, so the world is complicated, Ramona. great. I love that line. It works very well because it's something that I'm doing myself as well. Because when we talk about aesthetics, complexity is there all the time, and I talk also about memories in terms of complexity. Because with documentary in general, we have to touch the subject of memories. So I was wondering if you work in your field in terms of anthropology, if you could tell us a bit about the problematics in terms of combining anthropology with interactive documentary, which is something that we'll see probably this evening with Paolo Favaro as well. I really like that idea of combining disciplines, but from an IDOC point of view rather than the pure anthropology point of view. If I don't know if you get more or less. So I really like to see how it works from our point of view, our perspective.
Well, for me, it's about you need to create a dialogue, and so some of these juxtapositions, if you're not careful, can recreate binaries. So if you're juxtaposing, I think this, unless you can then use that as a starting point to create dialogue, you're not actually dealing with the binaries. So from an IDOC's point of view, there's a project called Question Bridge, which I think is probably the best example of using the interactive documentary medium, using juxtaposition and multiple point of view to actually create a dialogue. And it's about what it means to be a black male in American society. And, you know, it's a very complex issue, and people will put a question to an elder, and then they'll get lots of people answering. So you might have a young kid saying, why are so many black people in America in prison? And then you'll have lots of different people responding to that. And it's like a database narrative. But what I like about that project is it's not just online. They do a lot of work in the community, and actually they started really small. They started with, and it's artists, community engaged artists who are doing the project. So the aesthetics are very good. It's very beautiful and a very simple interface, but dealing with very complex subjects. And they just started in their own community asking this question. Then they got a small amount of money to hold a few workshops, and then gradually, so from very simple beginnings, they've grown it into this project, which is now goes across all the states, and which is actually being used, well, I don't know whether it still is, but under Obama, it was being used to help frame policy.
This is great, because obviously we see this today again, but you know, this idea of working with the community and creating a community is key for the interactive documentary forum, again in terms of research, you know, for field work, but also the idea of creating some sort of, you know, a platform that could, you know, collect all these different voices in one single point. So do you have any other questions? Anything else? One more time?
Can I ask, it follows on from my question to Gerson, because I think that Questioning Bridge is a really good example of how interactivity can become a collective experience, because there are groups, there are community groups. Do you know if much research has been done into how that interactive documentary is used in a collective way?
Well, that's the big impact. Is a big research area. I don't know specifically about that, but there's a place in America called the Harmony Institute, and they do conduct research, and they've done quite a lot around interactive work and its actual application. So they're worth looking at. But Ingrid Kopp's often, another big interactive person, is often saying we need to do more impact case studies. And Kate Nash at Leeds is doing that.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll discuss about this later during the roundtable, because you have a few people here that are working on collaboration, community, and interactive documentary. So thank you very much again for taking it.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for the invitation and for the introduction. Now, it's the second time actually I'm speaking on interactive documentary in Bremen. The first time was 2 years ago in the context of multimodality studies, where I also had a presentation on the subject and used interactive documentary as an example for multimodal media analysis. So today my presentation will go in a little bit different direction than the other presentations before, because I will focus, as the title already announces, on the audience research, how audiences or how people use and interact and play with interactive documentaries. I will start with just to say where I'm coming from, what was the idea of the project, because I'm not an audience researcher originally. Audience research is mostly done in Germany, at least in communication studies, and I'm coming from film media studies, and I'm coming from documentary films. That was, Stefano just said it, also my last project I finished about forms between documentary and fictional film. So I'm coming from that perspective, and found interactive documentary very interesting from the very beginning. And then in Leipzig there is a strong tradition of audience research done together between media and communication studies. So this was why I, with some other researchers, started a project on the audiences or the people of interactive documentary. So to have a framework or a context, we just heard that contexts are very important. Where was the idea coming from, starting from documentary studies or documentary film studies, and where we can see or we can map this trend of interactive documentary. Kai Hoffmann, who is the head of Haus des Dokumentarfilms, the House of Documentary in Stuttgart, he, in 2006, this is a quite old text now, but still I think valid, saw three trends of documentary production. The first trend is the use of new visual effects and high-resolution pictures in documentary, as you can see with the 3D experiments of Wim Wenders or Werner Herzog. The second trend he saw is the increasing use of user-generated content, amateur films, people working with YouTube, documenting their lives or subjects, and now we are here at the third trend, which is what he calls intermedia documentary in his text, which I would call interactive documentary, is that content is no longer produced only for television or for cinema, but intermediately between certain contexts, and that is where interactive documentary is. I'm coming to the second point. The thing is, when I'm teaching now film analysis in bachelor courses since almost 14 years, so it's, I think, always interesting to look how can we analyze these contexts. And we, when I was dealing with, I was doing a course on digital culture, and we were trying to develop a framework of how to analyze interactive media, and we were coming from film studies because we were saying, okay, film studies is quite established, there are several handbooks on film analysis, how we can adapt this concerning interactive content. And we had 3 or 4 areas where we found differences. The first is there's no narrative development only or structure, but it's a more open database. We can access at various points in this project, and we can end at various points. There's an aesthetic variety. There are not only film and sound, but also text, images, gameplay elements, and so on. And the most important thing, which is coming to mind first, is the positioning of the user. First of all, being interactive in some kind of way, but also in some of the projects, most of the projects I dealt with are more room-based instead of time-based. They are not linear, but multilinear. And if you want to deal with multilinearity, you always have to implement a structure that is more room-oriented. So this was what we found in a methodological way before we started the project. And what also interested me in a more theoretical way, and this is also the link to multimodality studies, is that interactive documentary allows not only to engage with image and sound, but it is more in the way of speaking to the whole body, as this is something also in film studies heavily discussed in the 1980s, that film is also using or speaking, addressing the human body, and I see this also as an extension in interactive documentary, that ID can also function as a human-machine circuit, if you want to put it in a science fiction terminology. So we are interacting with technology in some way or other. And this is not only happening cognitively and emotionally, like in film, but also there can also be tactile, active responses, especially when you enter something like an installation and so on. So we are speaking of a modal context, which is a term I borrowed from Vivian Sobczak, and she's also in film studies, but you also can use it here concerning interactive documentary, I guess. So finally, I will now come to this research project. When talking about interactive documentary, it's always I did a lot of talks, maybe 10, especially in front of people never heard about anything about web or interactive documentary. And people are like, oh, it's very interesting, I have to try. And when I met the people again and then asked them, did you try? And they say, oh no, I forgot about it, but it looked very interesting how you presented it. So the question is, what are really people doing with these interactive documentary? They are looking fine, that we have a lot of possibilities and versions, like the very open Korsakoff projects by Thalhofer on the one side, and other projects where the interaction possibility are not so high, but our question was, well, what can we do from it? We picked for this project an older example. You probably might know Prison Valley from 2010. It's also developed by the guys who did the Gaza Stero project on behalf of Arte. And it's quite a good subject, I think, to make an interactive documentary from it. It tells a story from the so-called land of prisons, Prison Valley in Colorado, and tries to map this area where a lot of prisons are, and they are doing interviews with inmates, but also workers, people who are there, and also telling the story of Prison Valley just in a documentary way. I think it's kind of a low-level interactive documentary. You can interact, but there's not so much possibilities like probably in the Korsakoff film. So we chose this project because of that, because we really wanted to confront people with the project and people who never maybe got in contact before with interactive documentary, and I think this is quite a good example to do so. I gave you maybe, who of you knows Prison Valley, or just try to some? I will give a very short, it's just a film clip I made here on my computer about interaction possibilities. At the beginning you drive with a car, it's a film clip to Prison Valley, and then you arrive at a motel, and then you check in at the motel with your name, and then you're shown a motel room, and this is the way you start your journey in this project. Now I just show you very quickly how this is looking for the ones who never accessed it.
Wäsche war weggekommen. Und Halina hatte bereits begonnen, mit uns Katz und Maus.
Unfortunately, it's the German version.
My name is Halina Dabrowska, in Polish. Dabrowski, American style. And my husband and me came to Florence in 1988, and we bought a small motel, the Riviera Motel, and we are still here. Riviera Motel, how can I help you? Yeah?
So now the film ends, this clip, and you can enter your room and register at the motel.
Dann hat Halina ihren selbstgemachten Wein hervorgeholt. Aus Trauben und Äpfeln. 100% polnisch, ohne jeden Zweifel. Auf der Visitenkarte des Riviera war zu lesen: Gastfreundschaft ist unsere Stärke. Das hätte auch die Devise von Fremont sein können. Dann sagte sie, wir sollten bleiben. Dieses Wochenende kämen Angehörige der Häftlinge hier ins Hotel. So auch Brenda. Wir ahnten noch nicht, wie sehr uns die Begegnung mit ihr erschüttern würde. Wir folgten Halinas Rat und bezogen Quartier.
So the film is ending here, and now we are in our room finally. And now what I recorded, I just looked around and moved the cursor and was looking into some of the possibilities I'm having in this room. For example, just looking out the window. Looking at the notebook, where there's a list of the persons with informations. Where I can discuss with other people on the topics of the project. These documents lying on the bed are mostly used for orienting oneself within the project. For example, this road map, you can see where every story takes place in the project. So this is just to give you a quick view on how it is looking. So now I will speak about, we had two, when we were trying to analyze the project, we had two ideas. First of all, we wanted to look at the text, at the project itself, and then we also wanted to look at how users really deal with the project. The first thing we were doing just were looking how we can map the project concerning the textual offers it is making. We found that there's some interaction, but mostly narration. There are film clips, the stories are told. So in this map of gaming, which is written by Fritz, we found it's not so much on the gameplay problem solving here. If we look closer at the project itself, this is the overall structure of the site, what we might call a sitemap. We see that we have the videos in the first line, the red line, and we have some detours we can make where we can access other possibilities within the project, and we can go on only if we looked at the complete video, and we finally then end at this blue thing at the end of the thing. And Interaktionsmöglichkeiten are the possibilities of interaction you have within the structure. We also did, this was done by some of my students who were working with this framework we tried to establish, was to do a protocol of itineraries, offers and possible detours to see what is happening in a room and what are the possibilities I have, what can I do within the room. So it's something like a film protocol adapted for an interactive documentary. So much more interesting than just looking at the text as it is the second step of analysis, the examination of user interaction. And we had two groups of 10 people each. They had 2 hours time for free exploration of the project, and we observed them while using it. Some were sitting in the back, and we were interviewing them for half an hour about their experience with the project. We tried to find web users who have some knowledge about the internet, who had no knowledge about Prison Valley, and who were about 20 to 60 years old, all genders included. What we were interested was the level of engagement. So what kind of elements they were selecting from the possibilities they get: low mid-level, like gameplay elements, high level of engagement, and the kinds of interaction. Are they only interacting with the documents? Are they interacting with the providers, with the makers, with the producers, like a feedback? Or are they also dealing with other users, like, for example, with social media, with Facebook? And so this is showing again how we had to try to find possibilities to put certain things in this low, mid or high level of engagement. Like watching just out of the window is low, but if you chat with other users or leave a video comment or something like that, it would be high level of engagement. So again, we used our protocol of interaction and made a third row at the very right where you see we added this level of engagement. So and then coming to the results, we saw now that mostly all of them looked all of the films. The videos were all looked at and accessed. Some of them were the blue space at the bottom of the graph here, researched additional data, and some options were skipped. This is the green thing at the top. And we see that Brenda's Geschichte, Brenda's story here, number 5, is many people accessed additional data. When we look, for example, at the information of Supermax, which is a prison, and not so many, more people skipped this option. So this is quite interesting, since Brenda's story is, as we already saw in this little teaser at the very beginning, is one very exceptional story with also emotional content, which was very interesting for most of the people. Concerning the levels of engagement, we saw that most of the people never really accessed bonus material, especially the more older people, 50, 60, they were shy about using all the possibilities. 33% used at least 1 to 5 times the possibilities, so at least some of them really accessed the bonus material, and we saw that low and mid-level of engagement was almost the same from the people, but high level of engagement material like uploading something also was very, only one person really did it and tried something. This is maybe also because of the environment, the setting, also interfering with it. So finally, we asked the participants if they have felt to be part of the research team and active producers of the discourse, and we found surprisingly that most of the people, almost 70%, didn't find that, and only 13% agreed with this thing. So most of the people just watched it as a documentary. So I'm summarizing my results. We can see that the project is mostly used, watched, listened in a traditional linear way, even it is multilinear. People were following the given paths of the project as a guideline, which is maybe a question of a growing media literacy, but also of the environment, of the test environment we used. Second, we found out that if users use other possibilities, they interact on the low and mid levels of engagement, and background information is more likely to be accessed when personal information is involved, for example, the emotional story of Brenda. When just factual information data is involved, the extra content is only rarely accessed. And what is also a thing we found out in the interviews is that a more open navigation is preferred when the contents are already familiar to users and when they see a necessity for discussion and participation. They said, okay, this Prison Rally thing is quite far away, it's in America, I never heard about it. If this would be a film about a political situation in Germany now, I would have accessed more bonus material or would be more active. So it's also a question of the topic involved here. And it's also a question of habitualization. So I come to my final conclusion. What does interactive documentary research teach us about the changes in media use and discourse creations? First of all, we see that there are new forms of discourse that are realized or co-realized by the recipient, who can also make own content and navigate actively, and he also has a tactile or sensory experience in doing so. The methodological consequences from it is that gameplay and interactive elements not only allow researchers to monitor effects on the user, but make a self-evaluation possible. Most of the people said, okay, I don't know, I'm thinking about myself, why did I use Prison Valley as I used it? So it was also giving the people an idea of what they are doing. The inner framework of understanding and reacting to audiovisual content are turned outside by the means of active engagement, by really dealing with film clips and so on. People reflect on it, and what normally happens just in the head is externalized in a way. And the third thing is also that documentary as a form, as a genre, as we might call it, is re-evaluated through this discussion process. There are forms where documentary is tried to be put in some drawers, like the discourse of sobriety, which is coined by Bill Nichols, or other discourses, and now probably a new, yet unnamed discourse, interactive discourse, I don't know, is maybe implemented and can be discussed. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
So great presentation. Thank you very much, Florian. I really like your way of analyzing this, moving from a more traditional linear film analysis to like an interactive, non-linear, and also how you introduce intermodality into this. I mean, it's already a complex field. Let's introduce more stuff. Great, thank you. I was just wondering. Sorry, taking over here. If you, of course, you're aware of Kate Nash research on Bear 71.
Yeah.
And she did a similar type of analysis as you do with Prison Valley, a focus group, and see the level of interaction, participation of this focus group with the project itself. So I was wondering if you compare your research with her research, which is published on an article on Studies Documentary Film, but also on the iDocs website. And it's quite striking what she found. What she found out is like the majority of the people, they didn't even interact with the project itself because they didn't know what to do. And especially then, obviously, there is an issue in terms of a generational issue as well. But not only, it's also the idea how we are used, we are trained in terms of watching an audiovisual project. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about this.
Yes. I was, when we started the project, I didn't know anything about the project, but when we were at the making the setup and just creating, I was reading about this project, and it was quite similar. What was a little bit difficult is that concerning reception studies or audience studies generally, there are big differences within American Anglo-Saxon studies and German studies, and since we were also working with some German researchers, they wanted to use their methods, texts, and so on. So we basically decided to make our own framework. But it would be really interesting to compare those two projects and see what comes out. Yeah, I still haven't done that. No.
Thank you very much. Question? We can take one. Anna, please.
At some point you talked about immersion and said that Prison Valley is not only interactive but also immersive. What is your notional concept of immersion in this context?
Yeah.
That was what I was wondering about.
Yeah. We were picking Prison Valley because we were just talking about maybe 5 or 6 projects and narrowed it down. When we were making the analysis, and we found that most of the students or co-workers of mine who use Prison Valley really feel to be there on spot at Prison Valley, because it's a closed environment, and it's an environment you never have been. No one of us probably have been to Prison Valley. So We enter this room by the means of the interactive documentary, and by going there, driving there, going in the motel room and so on, we are really immersed into this world. We get to know the people, we talk, we listen to the people, even if we cannot directly answer the people. In this case, I think the immersive aspect is mostly from entering this world and being part of it. And it also was an idea of the people doing it, of Paul and Die Fresen, to giving the audience, users, the feeling of being part of the team, of the research team being there, and even if that was difficult to accomplish, it also is part of this immersion thing, I think.
So it's a special notion and a social notion.
Yeah, mostly a social one, yes, I would agree.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. What is really important in terms of immersion, I believe, is also sound. So I'd like to hear a little bit about this during the round table, because I think it's kind of key in the process of immersion in interactive documentary. So thank you very much, Florian, again.